Chapter 1. The beginning of the long hair journey. Simran's hair had always been more than just an external feature. It was the embodiment of her cultural identity, her family's traditions, and the deep religious beliefs that had been passed down through generations. From the moment she was born, her long, thick, jet-black hair was seen as a symbol of purity and grace, tied directly to her faith and family legacy. As a little girl, she would run around her house with the ends of her hair trailing behind her, the soft strands swaying like a protective shield against the world. She didn't think much of it. To her, it was just part of who she was, a young girl with long hair, like everyone else in her family. Her mother spent hours braiding her hair, the delicate ritual full of quiet conversations and gentle smiles. It was a way of connecting with each other, of passing down stories of ancestors who had kept their hair long as a symbol of strength and devotion. "This is how we honor ourselves," her mother would say, weaving yet another braid into Simran's hair, "and how we honor God." As Simran grew older, this connection to her hair deepened. It was no longer just about tradition, it became an essential part of her identity. Her hair was a constant reminder of the rules that had always defined her life. It was a reminder that she was not just a person, but a part of something larger. Every knot, every tangle, every braid felt like a piece of the weight she carried, not just physically, but emotionally. For years, Simran lived in the comfort of this tradition. Her parents never questioned the practice, and she didn't either. Her hair, long and flowing, was not just hers, it was their connection to the past, to their faith, to their community. But as she entered her teenage years, something began to stir inside her. She started to notice the way some of her friends wore their hair differently, short, styled, free. Priya, one of the girls in her class, wore her hair in a sleek bob, and Simran couldn't help but be fascinated by it. Priya looked so confident, so effortless. Her hair framed her face beautifully, light and easy to manage. Simran couldn't help but wonder what it would feel like to have hair that wasn't weighed down by generations of expectation. She spent nights staring at her reflection in the mirror, her long hair flowing around her, but her thoughts were consumed with the idea of cutting it. She wondered what it would be like to have freedom from the rituals, from the rules that she had never questioned. Yet, with that thought came the guilt, the deep-seated sense that cutting her hair would be a betrayal, not only of her family, but of the faith they had raised her in. "Cutting your hair isn't just a haircut," her mother had said when Simran was younger. "It's an act of defiance against everything we believe in." And though those words had been spoken years ago, they echoed in Simran's mind, louder than any voice of rebellion. Chapter 2. The School Years and the Seed of Rebellion. As Simran grew older, the curiosity about cutting her hair never fully went away. It wasn't just a fleeting thought anymore. It began to linger in the back of her mind, a silent longing that gnawed at her as the years passed. Every time she saw someone with shorter hair, it was like a little crack appeared in the walls she had built around herself. Priya, Maya, and even some of the teachers at school, all of them wore their hair in styles that felt so modern and free. And yet, Simran could never shake the feeling that she was bound by something much greater than herself. Her mother's gentle but firm words haunted her, and every time the thought of cutting her hair resurfaced, it was immediately followed by guilt. It wasn't just about tradition, it was about the weight of expectations that Simran carried, the unspoken duty to uphold her family's beliefs. Every time she even considered the idea of cutting her hair, it felt like she was betraying everything she had ever been taught. She was just a teenager, still learning about who she was, and yet she was carrying the weight of so many years of tradition. In school, when Priya made a casual comment about her desire to cut her hair into a bob, Simran couldn't help but feel a twinge of longing. "I think a bob would look so much better on me," Priya said, flipping her hair back confidently. Simran admired the way Priya spoke about it, the way she wore her hair short with such ease. But when Simran imagined herself walking down the school hallway with shorter hair, her heart raced. Could she really do it? Could she really cut her hair and risk disappointing her parents, her family, and the very core of her identity? The thought of it felt like an impossible choice. Simran found herself torn between the pull of her desires and the weight of the tradition she had carried for so long. She would stare at her reflection in the mirror, tracing the length of her hair, wondering if it was time for something different. But every time she tried to imagine life without her long hair, the guilt came rushing back. Her hair wasn't just a part of her body, it was her connection to everything she knew. But deep down, Simran started to realize that the connection she felt to her long hair wasn't just a connection to her past, it was a link that held her in place, preventing her from moving forward, from becoming the person she truly wanted to be. Chapter 3: College and the Catalyst for Change. When Simran entered her second year of college, her world expanded in ways she had never imagined. She was away from home, living in a dorm, surrounded by people who were more diverse, more free than anyone she had encountered before. The distance from her parents allowed her the space to breathe, to explore, and most importantly, to think. It was here, in the newness of college life, that Simran started to discover who she really was, apart from the rules that had always defined her. For the first time in her life, Simran felt like she had permission to question everything. The diversity of the people she met, the freedom they expressed in their choices, particularly in their appearance, opened her eyes to a world that was unfamiliar, yet exhilarating. Maya, Reena, and Aisha, three of her closest friends, were all confident, unapologetically themselves. Maya had shaved her head once for the sheer joy of change, and Reena had worn a pixie cut for months. Aisha had even experimented with a vibrant shade of red for a while. Simran couldn't help but watch them, fascinated by the way they embraced their individuality, wearing their short, bold styles like badges of freedom. There was a part of her that felt drawn to their confidence. She couldn't help but wonder what it would be like to live without the constraints of tradition, without the invisible weight of expectations pressing down on her every decision. One evening, as they sat together in the dorm lounge, Maya casually mentioned her latest hair transformation. "I decided to go for a bob this time," she said, her hands running through her now sleek hair. "I feel like I've just let go of a lot of baggage. It's liberating." Something shifted in Simran at that moment. Maya's words were like a spark that set something inside her on fire. What would it be like to feel that sense of liberation, to let go of the baggage of her long hair and the expectations that came with it? Simran couldn't shake the thought. The idea of cutting her hair, of finally letting go of everything that had been weighing her down, consumed her. For the first time, she started to consider it seriously. She began imagining herself with a bob, her face framed by shorter hair. The thought made her heart race, not out of fear, but out of anticipation. Could it really be that simple? Could she really just make a choice for herself, for her own happiness, without worrying about everyone else's opinions? But the fear crept back in. What would her parents think? Would they ever forgive her? The guilt returned, stronger than ever. Simran found herself torn between the idea of cutting her hair and the sense of duty that had defined her life for so long. Chapter 4: The Decision. Simran couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted within her. Each passing day seemed to carry more weight, as though she were standing on the edge of a precipice, looking down at an unknown future. She felt it in her chest, the tension building up inside her like a knot that tightened with every passing thought about her hair. The truth was, she had been carrying the weight of tradition for so long that it had started to suffocate her. She was constantly torn between two worlds, the world of her parents' beliefs, where her long hair symbolized purity, devotion, and obedience to family and faith, and the world she was discovering for herself, where personal freedom, individuality, and the courage to break away from the past seemed like the key to unlocking her true self. In college, she had come to understand something that had always eluded her. Identity isn't something you inherit or simply adopt from your family. It's something you build for yourself. And yet, the thought of going against her parents felt like an act of betrayal, betraying the very fabric of who she had been raised to be. One night, as she lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, her thoughts raced. The clock ticked on, but it felt as though time had slowed to a crawl. She could almost hear her mother's voice, soft but insistent, telling her that cutting her hair was an offense, a rebellion against the sacred traditions they had followed for generations. Her mother's words echoed in her mind, "Cutting your hair isn't just a haircut. It's an act of defiance against everything we believe in." Simran's chest tightened as those words rang through her thoughts again. But for the first time in her life, she wondered if those words were holding her back, if they were the very chains that had kept her from stepping into her own future. The idea of cutting her hair, of stepping away from the familiar and entering the unknown, felt like the right thing to do. It wasn't just about a haircut, it was about breaking free from the confines of her past and embracing the person she had become in college. Simran sat up in bed, staring at her reflection in the dim light of the lamp. She was still in the same place she had been for years, her long hair cascading down her back like a veil that separated her from the rest of the world. But now, she saw her hair not just as a symbol of devotion, but as a barrier to her own freedom. It was time. She had made up her mind. The next morning, Simran called Priya, her hands trembling with anticipation. The decision was already made, but she needed to hear the support from her friend to reassure herself that she wasn't being reckless. "I'm going to do it, Priya," she said, her voice almost a whisper. "I'm going to cut my hair." Priya's voice crackled with excitement on the other end. "Simran, you don't know how happy this makes me. You're going to feel so free, I promise. It's the best thing you can do for yourself." Simran smiled as her nerves began to settle. It wasn't just about the haircut, it was about reclaiming her identity. It was about choosing her path, no longer letting the expectations of others define who she was. With Priya's encouragement echoing in her ears, Simran made the appointment. Her hands shook as she dialed the salon number, but she couldn't back out now. She had made her choice. The aftermath, a new identity. The day Simran sat in the salon chair felt surreal, like a dream unfolding at the edge of reality. As the stylist's scissors snipped through her long, cherished hair, she felt each cut as if it were severing not just strands, but years of tradition, expectation, and familial love. The weight that had once been a comforting presence seemed to lift with each passing moment, but with it came a hollow feeling, a mix of exhilaration and emptiness. There was a moment when she wanted to stop, to call it off, as if the finality of the decision had the power to unravel her entire identity. But as the long strands fell to the floor, Simran realized it wasn't just hair being cut, it was the years of unspoken expectations, the fears, and the guilt that had bound her for so long. A strange sense of liberation washed over her, but it was also tinged with sadness, a knowing that she could never quite go back to who she was before. When the stylist finished, Simran sat in stunned silence, staring at the woman in the mirror who seemed so different and yet so familiar. The bob was sleek, sharp, and undeniably modern, but it wasn't just a new haircut. It felt like a declaration, a quiet rebellion, and a long-awaited release all at once. She ran her fingers through the fresh cut, feeling the soft, delicate texture against her fingertips. The shorter hair framed her face perfectly, highlighting her features in a way she hadn't noticed before, the soft curve of her cheekbones, the glow of her skin, the brightness in her eyes. For the first time in years, she couldn't help but admire the reflection in the mirror. She felt pretty. More than that, she felt powerful. The woman staring back at her was confident, unburdened, and undeniably beautiful in a way that had never felt possible before. As she touched the new, shorter strands, the coolness of the air brushing against the back of her neck, she felt vulnerable, exposed in a way she hadn't anticipated. Her heart raced, a mixture of fear and pride swelling inside her chest. What if this was a mistake? What if she couldn't reconcile the woman she had become with the daughter her parents had raised? And yet, as the initial wave of fear passed, something inside her shifted. The vulnerability she had once seen as a weakness now felt like an emblem of her strength. She was no longer hiding behind the comfort of long, thick hair. She was standing fully in her truth, bare and unafraid to let the world see her as she was. But the journey didn't end with just the haircut. It was in the small, unexpected ways the world around her shifted. People noticed her differently. Strangers in the streets glanced at her with new eyes. Her friends, who had always seen her through the lens of familiarity, now stared at her with a mixture of admiration and surprise. Some even complimented her, calling her bold and stunning. She could feel the shift in the energy around her. She was no longer the same person she had been just hours ago. She wasn't sure if it was the haircut alone or the way it brought forth a new version of her confidence, but she could feel the change like an electric current running through her body. There was a shift in how she moved through her day. The act of walking out of the salon with this fresh look made her feel like she was stepping into a new version of herself. The sun seemed brighter, the breeze felt cooler against her skin, and everything felt somehow sharper. She walked taller, more aware of her presence. It was as though she had unlocked a new part of herself, one that had always been there, waiting for the courage to break free. Her new look, combined with this newfound sense of power, gave her a fresh perspective on everything, from the way she interacted with people to how she viewed her future. And yet, as the excitement of the transformation began to settle, so did a sense of loss. It wasn't just the hair she had let go of, it was years of tradition, cultural expectations, and the silent pressures of family that weighed on her. Her parents would not understand this change, would not understand why their daughter, who had always been so traditional, had suddenly rebelled in such a visible way. She had cut more than just her hair. She had cut ties to the part of her identity that had always been shaped by others. There was a grief in this change, a subtle ache that whispered in the back of her mind. Could she ever fully embrace this new version of herself? Was she ready to confront the consequences of this choice, to face the reactions of those who would question her, or even criticize her for something so personal? Simran paused and looked at her reflection one last time before walking out into the world. She knew there would be hard moments ahead, when she would doubt herself, when the weight of her choices would feel too heavy. But today, as she ran her fingers through her new cut, she allowed herself to savor the beauty of the moment. For the first time in a long while, she felt pretty. More than that, she felt like a woman who could create her own identity, who could choose to be whoever she wanted to be, free from the burdens of the past. She was both frightened and excited, but more than anything, she felt alive in a way she hadn't known before. The journey of becoming her true self had begun, and it was terrifying, exhilarating, and beautiful all at once. Chapter 5. The Family Reaction. Simran arrived home later that evening, her heart racing. She could already imagine her mother's reaction, the disappointment in her eyes, the quiet reprimand in her voice. She had never before done anything that defied her family's expectations, and she feared that this one decision might drive a wedge between them forever. As she stepped inside the house, her mother was in the kitchen, preparing dinner. The smell of spices filled the air, but it wasn't enough to mask the tension in Simran's chest. She cleared her throat, her voice trembling slightly. "Mom," she said softly, I did something today." Her mother looked up from the stove, her face soft but curious. "What is it, Beta?" she asked, a hint of concern in her voice. Simran hesitated for a moment, the weight of her decision settling over her. "I cut my hair. I got a bob." Her mother's expression immediately hardened, her brows furrowing as she set the spoon down on the counter. There was a long, heavy silence. Simran's heart sank as she saw her mother's face fall, the disappointment in her eyes clear as day. "You cut your hair?" her mother asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Simran nodded, her throat dry. "Yes, Mom. I wanted to. I wanted to try something different. It's just a haircut." Her mother's eyes searched her face, as though trying to understand if this was some sort of joke, or if Simran was truly serious. Simran could see the hurt there, the unspoken grief that her daughter had chosen to go against everything they had taught her. "You know," her mother said, her voice shaking slightly, "this is not just a haircut. This is rejecting everything we've taught you, everything we've stood for. It's against our beliefs." Simran felt a pang of guilt, but she held her ground. "I didn't mean to hurt you, Mom. I needed to do this for myself. I felt like I've been holding on to something that isn't me anymore." Her mother sighed, the weight of the moment settling between them like a heavy fog. I don't understand. I thought you understood the importance of tradition, of our faith. It's not just about the hair, Simran. It's about who you are and what you represent. Simran felt her heart twist, but she knew in that moment that this was about more than just a haircut. It was about her need to grow, to become someone she could be proud of, not just someone who lived in the shadow of expectations. I am who I am, Mom, Simran said quietly. This doesn't change who I am, or what I believe. It's just a change. A small one. Her mother didn't respond right away, but Simran could see the storm of emotions swirling in her eyes. She knew her mother was hurt, but she also saw something else, a flicker of understanding, a glimpse of the woman Simran was becoming. As the evening passed, the tension lingered in the house, but it wasn't as thick as before. Simran's father came home later that night, and when he saw her, there was a long pause. He was silent for a moment, inspecting her new look with a mixture of curiosity and concern. You really did it, huh? He said finally, his tone almost neutral. Simran nodded, not knowing how to explain it any better than she already had. Her father didn't say much more, but there was an unspoken acknowledgement in his eyes that Simran wasn't the little girl he had raised anymore. She was growing into herself, into the person she was always meant to be. The following days were filled with quiet conversations and subtle changes. Her mother never fully embraced the haircut, but she didn't reject Simran either. It was as if her mother had quietly accepted that her daughter had made her choice, even if it wasn't the choice she would have made. Simran felt a bittersweet satisfaction. It was hard to explain, but for the first time, she felt like she had taken control of her life. The pain of disappointing her parents would always be there, but she knew that, in time, they would understand. The person in the mirror was no longer the child she once was. She was a young woman, confident in her decision, ready to face whatever came next, no matter the cost. Chapter 6. The Ripple of Acceptance. After Simran cut her hair, she felt a mix of nervousness and hope. She had braced herself for a storm from her family, especially her mother. But as the days passed, she realized the real challenge wasn't her hair, it was how to bridge the gap between her new self and her parents' expectations. That evening at dinner, Simran's new bob framed her face. The silence was heavy, and her mother, stirring curry, finally spoke. Simran, I've been thinking a lot about your haircut. Simran's heart raced. I know, Mom, she said gently. I didn't do this to upset you. I just needed to feel free. It's part of who I am now. Her mother's voice was soft but unsure. I don't understand it. It's part of our identity, our faith. I raised you to honor our traditions. Simran met her mother's eyes. I still respect our traditions, but this was my choice. It's about finding myself. Her father spoke up, his tone calm. We've always taught you to be true to yourself. I see the courage in your choice. Simran felt a wave of relief. Her father hadn't condemned her decision. He had understood it. Her mother took a deep breath, placing her spoon down. I don't like it, but I see that you're happy. And that matters to me. Simran's throat tightened. Thank you, Mom. Her mother's hand reached across the table. Promise me you'll always remember who you are. No matter how you look, your values will remain. Simran nodded. I promise. Over time, the tension faded. Her mother began to accept Simran's decision, sharing stories about her own struggles to break free. It was a slow process, but Simran could feel the shift, a quiet acceptance that change didn't mean losing who they were. One day, her mother looked up from a photo album. Maybe we can find new ways to honor our traditions in ways that make sense for you. Simran smiled. Her mother was trying to understand. The next evening, the family went out for dinner, a small celebration, but it felt monumental. Her parents had begun to see that change didn't mean rejection, it was part of their shared journey. As they clinked glasses, her father smiled. To new beginnings. Simran felt a wave of gratitude. Her parents had accepted her choice, and they were growing together. The road ahead wouldn't be without challenges, but now, she felt at peace. Her family was learning to embrace her new self, and she was no longer alone in her journey.